and welcome to today's Critical Material Innovation Hub webinar. Webinar series was created for CMI by CMI. Today's focus is on community perspectives and how they resonate with individuals. My name is Celeste Straup, the Education and Workforce Development Program Manager for CMI, located at Colorado School of Mines, and today I will be your moderator. Before we get started, I want to cover a few logistics for today's webinar. First, the CMI Hub webinars are hosted by Colorado School of Mines. If you have any suggestions for a future webinar, please include those on the exit survey or email us at cmi@mines.edu. We would love to hear your suggestions. This is a public webinar. A recording will be available next week at aimslab.gov/CMI and also on our YouTube page. We will have a chance for questions and answers at the end of our presentation. But for now, please make sure you record those questions in the Q&A box so we can have them logged and ready to go once we get started. And for now, I'd like to introduce our two presenters, Erin and Nicole. Nicole is an associate professor in the mining engineering department at the Colorado School of Mines and a cultural anthropologist by training. And Erin is a research assistant professor in the mining engineering department at the Colorado School of Mines, and he is a geographer with a broad social science background. And with that, I'm excited to hear the presentation from Nicole and Erin, and I will hand it over to them.
Thank you so much, Celeste, and thank you to CMI for hosting the webinar, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Our talk today is titled, Do Critical Minerals Narratives Resonate? Community Perspectives on the Critical Minerals Boom. And what you're going to see today is part of a larger project funded by the Critical Materials Innovation Hub on social acceptance of critical battery mineral developments in the US. So one of our sub-questions of this research is what you're going to hear answered in part today. And I'd just like to recognize our team. We have a great team at Colorado School of Mines and a great team at University of Missouri Science and Technology. And that includes myself and Erin, who you're going to hear from today, Elizabeth Hawley, who's a professor here at Mines, Raphael Dubert, who has been a postdoc on this project, and Jordan Calderon, who's a graduate student on the project. And then at Missouri, we have Kwame Awa Ofai, mining engineer professor, Mahalet Fikru, an economics professor, and Bamadele Ajiga, who's a master's student working on our project as well. All right, so what do we mean by critical minerals narratives? And these are the claims that a lot of us hear in our everyday lives that are made by companies, government, and others that fundamentally position critical minerals with a higher level of importance, or as a factor that could influence social acceptance. And so on the screen, you'll see some examples of some of these narratives we see. We see them from mining companies, for example, domestic projects to mine nickel, cobalt, or lithium. We also see them from government agencies who designate what minerals are critical, employ industrial policy to promote production, and also make claims to the importance and relevance of critical minerals to things like national defense or energy transitions.
So our research is focused on mining projects specifically, and in that space, we see this underlying logic of critical mineral narratives are linked to a desire to shift the calculus about a project, as Nicole stated. So whether speaking to funders or policymakers or communities, critical mineral narratives suggest the importance of a particular project. The concept of critical minerals stands out in part because it appeals across multiple interests that are not always aligned. So critical minerals as a concept appeals to national security interests, such as the use of critical minerals in military equipment or for securing supply chains. It appeals to economic development interests, so focusing on domestic economic growth, on innovation, and on technology. And it also appeals to environmental interests, so people are focused on green technologies like electric vehicles or on energy transitions. And so conceptually, we can envision a critical minerals consensus like this Venn diagram, where interests in security, economy, and the environment all converge around critical minerals. And so in this presentation and in our research, what we want to understand is if this imagined convergence of interests is resulting in the formation of a critical minerals coalition. So our research questions are: how do critical mineral discourses influence perceptions of and reactions to mining proposals? Do critical mineral projects have more public support or social acceptance than quote unquote ordinary minerals? So basically, our goals are to understand what public perceptions are around critical minerals and what the implications of that are for social acceptance. Our research uses a multi-site case study methodology. Our site selection criteria was to focus on areas where new critical mineral projects have been proposed or are being developed, as well as to select sites that have diverse sets of social, economic, and environmental characteristics. Right now, our project is focused on nickel and cobalt projects because of their role as battery metals. So these are our three core case study sites. The first is Missouri, and I'm going to keep this very brief, so I apologize if it's a little simplified, but just in the interest of time. So the first site is Missouri. This is a broadly supportive context for mining projects, and we're looking at a specific example where a historic lead mine is being redeveloped as a cobalt mine. The second is Idaho, which again is a broadly supportive context. There's lots of existing mining for various metals happening within that region in the communities around there. And there are two new projects focused on cobalt. And then the third is Minnesota. Minnesota is a polarized context where there is quite a bit of support, but there's also quite a bit of organized opposition to mining projects. And we're focused in particular on three projects that each would produce a different combination of copper, nickel, and cobalt. And one note just to emphasize, one of the important characteristics that's shared across all three of these sites is that they all have a long history of mining in their areas.
Great. So our talk is organized around our methods, actually, and our project employs multiple methods with a team including faculty and scholars from anthropology, geography, economics, mining engineering. And so our mixed methods approach is both iterative and complementary. And so it's iterative in that qualitative data through interviews helped inform questions to ask in our surveys. So we have interview-based qualitative research that's taken place in all of our case study sites. We've conducted more than 90 interviews and site visits. And then we used that to inform the questions that we would ask in our discrete choice survey experiment. And so this is a quantitative methodology that allowed us to reveal patterns that guided additional interviews that we could explore through other qualitative methods. And then there are also complementary methods in that our quantitative methods provide a broad view of what perceptions exist, and the qualitative methods offer this depth in understanding why people hold those perceptions. And so together, this approach provides holistic insights that neither method could produce alone. And so I mentioned our interviews. These are, generally one-on-one interviews. Our discrete choice survey we administered among the 3 states, and across the 3 states, we collected 1,850 surveys. And then we also conducted local surveys at 2 public festivals, one in Missouri, one in Idaho, to engage kind of harder to reach populations for more descriptive and analytical insights on local perceptions. And from those, we collected about 350 surveys across Idaho and Missouri. And you'll see how those fit into and inform our research as we move along.
So the first part of the research that we're going to highlight is our qualitative interview-based research. As Nicole noted, we've done more than 90 interviews across our 3 core case studies, and actually more than 150, including some complementary sites. But today I'm going to focus specifically on the Minnesota case study. So in Minnesota, we've done more than 30 interviews, and that's what this research draws on. So the key question that we're focusing on here is whether groups that typically oppose mining would instead accept these particular mines because of the critical minerals links. So what we're looking at is environmental organizations, indigenous nations, and other community actors. And the reason that we're focusing this way, focusing on these actors, is because within the kind of imagined critical minerals consensus or coalition, these are the groups that are adopting a position farthest from their typical stances. So these are groups that often oppose mines on environmental grounds, but are being imagined or asked to accept certain mines because of their links to green technologies. And so what we want to analyze in this section is whether that is really happening. So broadly, what we found in the first slide there, yeah, is that environmental organizations in the Minnesota case are mostly contesting or not taking these critical mineral claims at face value. They're asking questions like, are the minerals really needed? Are the proposed mines actually significant sources for those minerals? And are the proposed mining projects actually realistic on technical and economic grounds? I think an example will help to demonstrate this. So let's look at nickel. One of the key reasons that nickel is considered a critical mineral is because of its use in batteries. But opponents in Minnesota have been vocal in noting that battery chemistries are changing rapidly. So LFP batteries that don't use nickel or cobalt are already the norm in China for electric vehicles, and they're gaining ground here as well. If you follow the news, you might have seen Ford's recent announcement of a new EV platform and that's going to be based around LFP batteries. So these shifting battery chemistries then, in conjunction with the long timelines for mine permitting and development, leave opponents questioning whether nickel or cobalt will even be battery metals by the time that production could begin, recalling that all of these projects are some years out from actual commercial production, right? So thus, they're rejecting the idea that accepting these mines would be a trade-off or a sacrifice that was justified by its contribution to what they care about, which is green technologies or energy transitions. And so you see in this quote, it sums up that they're instead insisting on looking for alternatives and especially ways to reduce need or to think about recycling and alternative sourcing. So you see this quote from a tribal government official: have we done as society and the mining industry as part of that, have they done their due diligence to look for alternatives for these supposed critical minerals? And another quote, I think, again, helps to underscore this idea, demonstrating the reluctance of environmental organizations to shift their positions based on this critical minerals framing. And so this quote says, even the phrase critical minerals is something that's designed by industry to help drive interest. But one of the things we've talked about is, well, what else is critical? Water is as critical as it gets, especially in a warming climate. So again, just demonstrating the the reluctance of some of these environmental actors to shift positions. So to sum up this kind of first section of our first approach, what we found in this Minnesota case study is that the criticality concept is not seeming to disrupt the traditional dynamics of opposition to mining, that the groups, environmental groups, indigenous nations, and others are not jumping into an imagined critical minerals coalition. They're questioning the way criticality is defined and operationalized. And at least again, in this case, they have not seen that the supposed environmental benefits are valuable enough to overcome their kind of default opposition to new mining projects. So I think another takeaway from this is that environmentalists that we interviewed felt that if there is indeed a convergence between economic security and environmental interests to form a critical minerals coalition, they feel like junior partners in that model. They feel like their interests are subordinated to security and economic interests. And so you have a final quote here that the earlier version, referring to the critical minerals concept, this environmental organization leader felt is just a shortcut to mines. It wasn't a real kumbaya moment because there was no concession for environmentalists, right? And so again, you see this idea that environmentalists feel like the three interests in our Venn diagram are not evenly or fairly balanced in their view.
All right. So remember, we have our multidisciplinary research, and the purpose of this collaboration is to do things we couldn't do alone. So I'm going to talk about the discrete choice surveys, but I just want to make it clear that I'm not a statistics person. This is work that's being led by Kwame and his team. So I won't be able to answer all your questions about these data, but I do want to highlight the key conclusions and how they contribute to the big picture. So if you recall, we had 1,850 surveys across the 3 states. And so we had statistically representative samples from each state. And the surveys asked people to weigh trade-offs between employment, tax revenue, and environmental impacts from hypothetical mining projects. So participants were split between 2 framing scenarios. So participants received either one of 2 framings of the overall survey. The first framing, so half of the respondents, were told that the mine would produce gold and silver, while the other half were told that the mine would produce lithium and cobalt for batteries. So this study does many things, but here I just want to highlight the analysis of the impact of this critical minerals framing on the respondents' preferences. So if we look here, the top number in each box represents the correlation coefficient between the variable, whether that's jobs, job creation, tax revenue, etc., and support for a mining project. The values in parentheses represent the standard error with statistically significant values marked with asterisks. So in general, what we see is the framing of projects as supporting critical mineral production did not alter overall preferences. We do see a couple of interesting things, however. And we see, whoops, I'll go back here. We see overall, if we look at the jobs category, the top boxes, we see that job creation emerged as the most consistent and positively evaluated project attribute across all groups and regions. So this suggests that direct employment opportunities remain the most visible and trusted benefit of new mining development, whether for critical minerals or not. And then the framing did seem to shape how respondents evaluated revenue from taxes and tailings reprocessing. So for precious metal projects for the gold and silver full sample, the projected tax revenues were a factor that drew support, but for critical mineral projects, it was not significant. And then furthermore, in tailings reprocessing was more strongly preferred in the critical minerals framing, indicating a possible preference for tailings reprocessing when it comes to critical minerals.
All right, and then finally, our third method, which kind of strikes a balance between the other two, was to conduct surveys at local events. So we set up a survey booth at local fairs and festivals. We basically put up a tent. We invited people to come and take a survey. We offered small gift cards to motivate participation. And as Nicole noted at the start, this is a novel methodology we employed specifically to make sure that we were capturing the perspectives of often hard to reach rural populations. We want to make sure that we're getting beyond just the local leaders who we might interview in our qualitative research to hear from quote unquote ordinary people who might not be all that engaged on these issues, but whose perspectives are actually quite important to understanding the dynamics around social acceptance. We know from the survey methodology literature that both traditional telephone and mail survey methods have been really struggling in recent years with declining response rates for decades, really. We also know that door-to-door surveys are expensive and difficult, bring their own challenges. And so this method that we've been employing allows us to hear from ordinary residents, but bypasses some of the challenges of some of those more traditional approaches. As a reminder, we did both of these were this summer, and we collected just less than 200 surveys in Idaho and just more than 160 in Missouri. And so the analysis is still ongoing, but we're going to highlight some of the preliminary results from this. So again, as you'll recall from the introduction of the case studies, Idaho and Missouri, the case study sites that we're looking at are both broadly supportive context for mining. And actually, this survey allowed us to confirm that what we believed to be true and indeed found to be true. We asked a question in the survey, what people's general opinions about the mining industry broadly. In Idaho, we found that support outpaced opposition by 6-1. So that's 66% of people who were broadly supportive of the mining industry versus 11% who had negative perceptions of it. In Missouri, we found support outpaced opposition by 11-1. And that's with 58% positive responses about the mining industry and just 5% negative. Nicole, you've got a reminder showing on your screen.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thanks. So within these two broadly supportive contexts, then one of the things we really wanted to understand and that links to this presentation is the relevance of these critical minerals narratives. So we asked this set of questions: to what extent do the following factors influence your opinion about mining projects in this area? So if the project strengthens the local economy, if the project strengthens the national economy, decreases dependence on imports, if the product would be used in military or national security applications, or if the product would be used in green technology or electric vehicles. And so what we found is that in both sites, the ordering of the responses was the same. The choice with the highest support was if the project strengthens the local economy. The next highest support, again, the ranking is the same in the two contexts. The next highest support was strengthening the national economy, followed by decreasing dependence on foreign imports. The options that were most closely aligned with the critical minerals narrative, so if the minerals would be used for military technology or green technology, neither of them were negative, but they were both had fewer positive and more neutral responses. And so the way that we interpret this, our takeaway, is that among these populations, which again are generally supportive of mining, that their support seems to be more motivated by local economic benefit than by critical mineral narratives. Again, it's not a negative factor, it's just less compelling. So people don't care as much about it compared to those local economic benefits.
All right. So recapping the results from our three different interviews or our three different methods, I'm sorry. In the interviews, we found that Minnesota environmental groups questioning critical minerals framing, critical minerals framing and oppose new copper, cobalt, and nickel mine proposals. From our discrete choice surveys, we found that few significant differences exist in responses for gold or silver mines versus critical mineral mines. And then in our local event surveys, in Minnesota and Idaho, which are generally supportive contexts, the local economy was the most compelling reason to support a mining proposal, and end uses such as military, national security, or green tech were the least compelling reasons to support this. So we conclude that critical minerals narratives have limited resonance, but do have a positive valence. And so these narratives aren't necessarily a negative factor, but they're also not the most compelling driver of public views. And this holds across support, neutral, and opposition groups. And so one way of interpreting this would be to argue for more education, more public relations and communication work, to say, well, people just don't understand where their things come from or how critical these minerals really are. But we think the stronger point is to recognize that critical mineral mines are, at the end of the day, just mines. They're not viewed fundamentally different by the public, and their development faces largely the same opportunities and hurdles as other mining projects. And in Minnesota, the example of Minnesota brings this conclusion out really clearly. Environmental groups in Minnesota, their opposition is not rooted in a lack of education or a lack of knowledge on the topic. You can see how they had done their research on battery chemistries. They understood what the new technologies was. No less, it really reflects these different perspectives, values, and risk tolerances of different populations. So we conclude that social acceptance of critical minerals mining is driven by the same dynamics as mining in general, with the same challenges and opportunities. And so, moving to a final quote, I'd like to read this. This is from an interview with an elected official in Minnesota, and basically says, I never hear about critical minerals from people outside of the Capitol. I think this idea about critical minerals is very much an inside the dome or an insider type of argument. Policymakers, industry people, academic, people like you and me are constantly talking about critical minerals. But the number of times I've heard from constituents about, well, where do we get our nickel for our Teslas is zero. And I think this quote ultimately might be frustrating for people like many of us here who want the public to care about critical minerals and their sourcing. But our research is not necessarily or not at all about how public opinion should be or whether people's views are correct. It's about understanding what those views actually are. And so again, rather than assuming that more outreach will shift acceptance of critical minerals projects, our evidence suggests that critical minerals projects will continue to be treated as mining projects. Even among supporters, critical mineral framing is rarely the decisive factor. There are, however, some caveats to bear in mind, and we don't want to oversimplify. And I want to reiterate that our research is about identifying trends, and we don't want to flatten out these variations that do exist. And for example, and one of the examples I give is that while most environmental groups have not changed their stance on mining because of critical minerals narratives, we did find at least one exception with an environmental group in Idaho who has come out in relative support of a cobalt project there because of the end use environmental benefits, but remain opposed to a nearby gold project. And so we do see these nuances and these exceptions to what we're finding. And we did also see some small but notable differences in the discrete choice experiments, though the big picture showed mostly the same across gold and mineral projects. So all in all, our conclusion is that critical minerals mining is often perceived at the same as any other type of mining, and that these narratives aren't necessarily landing or taking hold among the stakeholder groups that we've identified and have interviewed. So we are happy to take questions or comments now. I know there's a question Q&A box somewhere.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Aaron, for your presentation. It was great learning more about public perception and social acceptance of these very important topics, things like you shared that we're all very interested in learning more about. And so at this time, we did just get one question that popped into our Q&A box. So Aaron, if you want to take a look at that, Nicole, and then
Yeah, let
just keep going
me
answer that.
let me read that out here. So the question is, are there studies that look at how people who do not live in mining regions feel to compare the populations who would benefit from boosts to their local economies? Also, do you collect and analyze demographic data like age from the respondents? So I can start off answering that. Yes, so I'll start at the bottom. Yes, we have the demographic data both for the discrete choice and for the local festival and fair surveys, especially for the latter. That's a really important check for us. It's not possible with that setup. It's a convenience sample. You can't have a statistically representative sample from that method, but we can compare the demographics of who we talk to the demographics of the community to check whether we're overrepresenting certain groups. Potentially adjust, although I don't believe that's necessary. I think we've been really happy with the broad response. And I do think that having the survey incentive, the small gift card, helps with motivating people who might otherwise not take the time, but to take the time for the survey so we get a broad response. One study that I would point to, not our own work, but there is a really interesting study in Minnesota that did a survey at the state fair. So it's a broader sample of the statewide population, and they draw interesting differences between people who are local to the area and people who live farther away. And I do think you touch on a really important geographic or scalar pattern here that's important to recognize, especially in thinking about whether environmental groups might adopt a different position around critical minerals, is that you might get very different answers when you look at national or even globally focused organizations versus at the local level where the projects actually occur. And so it's important to bear that in mind of those scalar differences within particular groupings, that there will be different dynamics at local versus state, regional, national, and other scales.
So the next question is, do you think that these findings might be different in mining regions in the global south, or is there any existing research on this? Great question, Mateo. Nice to see you on here. I don't believe there's other research on this, although don't I won't say that definitively. And my guess, I mean, I would just have to give a guess on this, but my guess would be that the findings wouldn't be different in the global south, especially in terms of reasons to support a project, in terms of the survey that we did that showed that local economic developments were the most compelling reason to support a project. And my guess or my hypothesis would be that that would be similar across the global south, and then the issues of national security and green transition or green technologies would also fall quite low. We found in some of our cases, like in rural Idaho and in rural Missouri, people said, we don't think EVs are practical here. Nobody drives EVs here. And so I think we might see those similar responses in areas of the global south. But great question great research question to take up.
Well, we still have some time for some more questions, so please feel free to add those into our Q&A box. But in the meantime, I will ask you two a question. What's next? So now that you've gotten some of these results, what are some of the next steps you guys are considering taking to kind of gain other perspectives or broaden your research?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So just to note too, and we mentioned this, Celeste, to you in planning, but for others, this is research that's in progress. This is actually more or less kind of three separate papers and then a big picture paper that will pull all this together, similar to this presentation, none of which are published yet. So we are still presenting preliminary work here. And so the immediate next step is to actually get all of this out there into the scientific literature. But I think that one of the things that we're really excited about is finding success with the local survey method, and we're excited to expand that methodology. There's very few people doing that, and so we think that that's something really interesting that can help understand, again, these very hard to reach rural populations that are often overlooked in research that only talks to the key stakeholders, or that only takes these broader samplings that are not quite as locally zoomed in on those specific sites. So I think we're really excited to continue forward with that.
And Carly has a question. Would your findings be different if you interviewed and surveyed technology end users versus the surrounding community members? For example, more of a positive correlation for national security or green tech? I would imagine that you would, I guess, I hypothesize, and again, another good research question. I would hypothesize that end users would probably be more supportive for whatever end use they're using the materials for. So if it's, a EV automator, then, or automotive maker, EV car maker, then I would say that they probably would have a more positive perspective on that. So I do think, again, another interesting hypothesis to test for sure. And I do love how research brings more questions to answer.
So the next question here, are there any studies being conducted or contemplated that consider non-battery uses for critical minerals? So just to emphasize the beginning point for this research project, we've been working on this for about 2 years. It explicitly started from critical battery materials. That was kind of our starting point. And so that's why we're focusing on nickel and cobalt. I do think that your question, Stephen, um, it touches on one of the things that we were most surprised about in the local fair and local festival surveys. Again, knowing that these are supportive contexts and reconfirming what we knew about those contexts, we actually were somewhat surprised to see how low the military and national security concept ranked. We weren't terribly surprised that local economic benefit was first, but we didn't expect military use to be second to last in terms of the interest. So I do think that that touches a little bit on what you're getting at of moving away from just the battery connection, knowing that things like cobalt and nickel have lots of other uses, cobalt in particular with a lot of military applications. So I think that that's tied in there to some extent. We were emphasizing in part the as I explained with the Minnesota example, we felt like that it was important to dig in on the environmental groups in part because that imagined kind of Venn diagram has them moving farther away from their typical positions than the other actors who might already be expected to support these projects. And so that in particular is why we really emphasize that. But I think it's a great point, and we do want to definitely make sure that we're continuing to consider the full breadth of the ways critical minerals are both used and narrativized.
Yeah. Yoshiko's question, it would be interesting to go back and re-interview the same people to see how or whether attitudes change over time as mining projects progress, or same populations, if not necessarily the same individuals. Yes, Yoshiko, we have been doing this to a certain extent. So, which is such the benefit of longitudinal, longer term research. So one thing that we didn't mention at all in our Missouri case is that we have been doing interviews there for the past almost 2 years now. And we did a lot of interviews. And then last October, I think a lot of you probably know, in this town where the cobalt mine's being built, there was also a battery recycling plant that had a catastrophic fire last October. So when we went back in March or May to do the surveys at the county fair, we incorporated questions to understand, one, if people's perceptions of the battery recycling plant had changed since the fire and if they were looking forward to it rebuilding or not. And then two, if that fire of the battery recycling plant impacted people's perceptions of the cobalt mining project. Because even though they weren't necessarily connected, we wanted to understand if people were seeing them as connected or part of the same industry, or what, if that fire had impacts on the cobalt mine. And we found that it really didn't make much of an impact on people's perceptions of the cobalt mine. So yes, and those are definitely things that we're interested in understanding is in the Idaho case. It gets longer and longer away from the Idaho cobalt mine kind of closing. They sort of started to open, they brought in a bunch of employees, and then the price of cobalt fell, so they never opened it. They sort of went on a long-term or suspension. And so we see in the Idaho case, kind of the longer and longer it goes, people are like, is this mine going to open? And, they say like every year we say one more day until it opens. So I think that there is a lot to learn about fatigue from waiting for these projects to open, about hopes and expectations not being met. So absolutely, I think that's really important. Not
Yes,
cheap.
I guess another question, is this mainly a framing issue based on Minnesota respondents' priorities, could highlighting import replacement and local value add as key community outcomes change perceptions? So again, I think it's a great question. I think that, I think as Nicole kind of hinted at in the last two slides, we certainly don't want to be misunderstood as saying that education and outreach are in any way bad or shouldn't be done. I think our broader point example highlighted that opponents were not necessarily coming from a place of ignorance so much as a place of different values and different interpretations. So I do think that highlighting some of those things about economic benefits, about securing supply chains, about local development, all of those things are positives. And as we saw in the two local in both of the survey methodologies, we saw that those local economic benefits were the most compelling reason that people supported mining projects. We just saw that it was not a differentiator between critical mineral mines and mines for other substances. So I think that you're absolutely right that those things are important and are important drivers of support for projects. But that we felt like it was less of a differentiator than a shared characteristic.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Nicole. You guys got through all of the questions in the Q&A. We still have some time if anyone pops any more in there, but I'll have Nicole go to the next slide and I'll kind of start to wrap us up. And then if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to add them as we kind of close out today's webinar. So this recording will be available in about a week on aimslab.gov/CMI and also on our Critical Materials Innovation Hub's website or YouTube channel. My apologies. Also, heads up, we do have another webinar coming October 21st, where we invite members from T2M Global to present on lower cost lithium recovery waste heat-driven direct lithium extraction. And so details for that webinar will be sent out in the Critical Times newsletter and can be found on our above webpage. If you have any suggestions for future webinars, topics, or presenters, or any feedback you would like to give us, please complete the exit survey or email us at cmi@mines.edu. At this time, I think we will say farewell and thank you. Thank you again, Nicole and Aaron, for your presentation. It was very insightful, and I look forward to learning more as your research progresses.
Thank you.
Thank you.